Hey there, Corey Brettschneider.
Hi, Glenn.
Hey, this is the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv. I'm happy to welcome my colleague in the political science department here at Brown, Corey Brettschneider. Corey, you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. Thanks, Glenn, for having me on. My name is Corey Brettschneider. I'm a professor of political science at Brown University, and happy to be one of Glenn's colleagues.
Corey, I invited you. Oh, thank you for saying that.
That's
a high
it's a
compliment.
pleasure.
Not every economist, I want people to know, can have such a thing said about him outside of the economics department.
We're maybe a little more polite in political science. Not that much more, but a little.
Yeah, your seminar culture is very different from ours. You let speakers finish their presentations, and then you're orderly and disciplined, and you're asking them questions.
Right. Well, I've got a lot of good too, so that teaches me to interrupt. So I've got both in me.
Corey, I wanted to talk to you today because I've been very impressed by your book, which I'm holding up in front of the camera right now. When the State Speaks, What Should It Say? It's Princeton University Press. That's, as good an academic press as it's going to get for a book of political theory. And you've been writing about speech and about free speech and how we ought to think in a liberal democratic society about restrictions on speech and when they're appropriate and what the role of the government is in protecting vulnerable minorities against the consequences of hate speech and this kind of thing. And it's such a good thing for us to be thinking about these days, given, for instance, this brouhaha that's erupted over someone's making of a film that disparaged and presented in an unflattering light Prophet Muhammad, and reactions to that and questions have arisen about it. And so I just thought it would be a good thing for us to talk about. I certainly learned a lot from reading your book. Do you want to start out framing our conversation by just talking a little bit about sort of some of the themes in the book, and then maybe we can get over to some more concrete cases where you would apply your theory this way or that?
Sure, that sounds great. So the idea of the book is to answer a common charge that's often hurled at liberals, and especially liberals who defend very robust free speech protections. That charge is often that liberals are people who can't take their own side in an argument.
Yeah.
And the worry about people who offer very robust defense of free speech in the American tradition, and we are really exceptionalist, I guess, in our protection of really all viewpoints from punishment, no matter how heinous. The worry about that kind of view is that it's impotent against not just falsehoods, but attacks on the very foundation of free speech itself, the foundation of liberal democracy. So in the rest of the world, as I found in talking about the book, there are some limits on free speech when it comes to racist speech or speech that challenges some of the fundamental principles of democracy. The tradition, for instance, of militant democracy is prominent in other places in the world, which tries to limit free speech when it comes to either hate speech or deeply inegalitarian speech.
I mean, what would be an example of that, just for concreteness' sake?
Well, take Germany, for instance, which bans Holocaust denial. There are free speech protections in Germany, but the idea is that given the German history and given the egregiousness of denying the fact of the Holocaust, that this is just something that can't be allowed. And so there's actually punishment in Germany for Holocaust denial.
And just so I could be clear, do they have a very clear understanding of what constitutes Holocaust denial? I mean, how critical of the existing historical narrative can you be before you cross over the line and become a denier?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And certainly defenders of free speech, I think, worry about punishment. If you look at a lot of the cases, I don't really think that's an issue. I think the cases are usually brought against people who either deny or minimize to such a great extent the facts that that there are issues, I think, that might come with borderline cases, but at least a lot of the ones that I'm familiar with aren't those borderline cases. So anyway, as I was saying, the book is an attempt to do a third thing, not just to defend free speech and to be a liberal who can't take his or her own side in an argument, and also to reject the idea of militant democracy. And the third way forward that I want to offer is both a defense of the doctrine of viewpoint neutrality, which says that any viewpoint should get protection, no matter how heinous, from punishment, to offer defense of that, but also a second requirement for democracies that have this doctrine. And that's the requirement that they articulate the reasons for the doctrine, and that they offer a defense of the underlying values of freedom and equality that give rise to free speech and the doctrine of viewpoint neutrality itself. So my theme throughout the book is protect, yes, from criminal punishment, even egregious speech, or anti-democratic speech, but that the state, when it speaks in its expressive capacities, I say, has an obligation to criticize some of those views that are protected. So Holocaust denial, in my view, should be protected from punishment, but there also is a robust role for the government in criticizing it. And that expressive capacity, I say, can take a lot of different forms, ranging from education to public monuments or public holidays. And the most controversial proposal is that when the state uses its spending power and its subsidy power, it should refuse to subsidize hateful viewpoints and give robust preference to those viewpoints that defend the ideals of liberal democracy. So the idea is, I defend the American exceptionalist idea that we should protect from punishment all viewpoints, but I also want to add this other part to the story of the state's expressive capacities and provide a robust role for it in defending the ideals of what I call free and equal citizenship, the underlying ideals of free speech itself.
Okay, so there's a kind of argument going on at more than one level, if I understand.
Yeah, exactly. I think the whole problem with free speech discussions is it's been about one thing. Do we ban the thing or not? Do we punish the video or not? Do we punish the Holocaust denier or the racist or not? And I think that just misses the nuanced ways that the state has to respond to speech that's false, as in the Holocaust denial, or not just wrong, but deeply against the ideals of liberal democracy itself, as in lots of instances of racist speech. And so protect or not protect is one of the dimensions. But the other dimensions that have to be brought out, I think, in this discussion are the other capacities that the state has. And I always like third views. I think they're often missed in discussions that are about ban or don't ban, because they have a way of not just dismissing the rest of the world's concern about these forms of speech and their partly their falsehood and potentially their danger to liberal democracy itself. It's a way of not dismissing those concerns without just moving to the act of criminalization the way that the rest of the world has. So I think that we live in a world that's, unfortunately divided into two about this issue of free speech. One, the American way of basically protect everything, and the rest of the world, which is to impose criminal sanctions on some forms of expression. And I think we need a third way.
So the state, on this account, ought not to be precluding people from voicing what might be noxious views or views that are themselves inconsistent with or critical of liberal democratic values. It should talk back.
Exactly.
Allow that talk, but use its expressive capacity to counter these things. But the question I want to ask you is whether that argument, dependent upon it being unproblematic, uncontroversial, what are these liberal democratic values that the state should be trying to promote in its expressive capacity? Can't one have an argument about that?
Yeah. I think that's right. And I do think that there are issues at the margin, certainly when we talk about what equality requires. So take the ideal of equality under law and the affirmative action debate, for instance, which I think there's lots of reasonable disagreement about. The question of whether equality requires a colorblind approach to the Constitution and to the ideal of equal protection, or a color-conscious one. So those are not issues that I think, and these issues of reasonable disagreement, where the state should jump in. But there are other issues, I guess, which I think aren't issues of reasonable disagreement and where we have reason to protect the speech, but it's not because it's potentially consistent with democratic ideals. So take Holocaust denial. I mean, I just don't think that there's any question about the fact that the Holocaust happened. And there are reasons that the Germans, for instance, give in banning Holocaust denial that are good ones. I just think that the benefit that comes from allowing false speech combined with the approach that I'm suggesting outweighs any approach that would just simply ban those views. You get the benefit of the public discourse, of pulling these views out into public, of not forcing them underground, of not giving them a certain fetishization. And yet you can recognize, too, that, and unlike, I think, unfortunately, a lot of the tradition in the American free speech tradition, that Holocaust denial is just wrong, or certain forms of, David Duke's approach to politics, or the Klan's approach to politics, or Mein Kampf, or you can take your list of ideologies that I think are just off the charts, anti-democratic and wrong. I think those aren't borderline cases or issues of reasonable disagreement, unlike the affirmative action debate. And in those instances, I think, those, even in the free speech tradition, should recognize that there just are certain ideas that are false or that are wrong, and that we can simultaneously protect them for our own reasons, and yet recognize that the people who are being protected often just reject the reasons for free speech in the first place. Fundamentally, the idea of equality under law is what's common, I think, to all of those views that I just mentioned, that they all really reject it.
Well, what I was about to ask you is whether, banning might not work.
Right.
And it is illiberal.
Mm-hmm.
It, as you say, might force views underground. Mm-hmm. You can make Holocaust denial illegal, but you can't stop people whispering it to one another.
That's right.
The act of making it illegal might actually lend cachet to the act of whispering it
I think that's very
amongst each other. We can define ourselves in contradistinction to this enforced regime of political correctness and so on.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, don't we have to presume something about the effectiveness of the state's propounding, a counter narrative? You allow the speech, but then you counter it through the state's expressive capacity.
Right.
To the extent that that's ineffective, that the state doesn't have the muscle, at the end of the day, maybe you end up by being willing to argue with someone's noxious views, but not being able to win that argument, tacitly conferring a kind of legitimacy or status on the view. It's a view worth arguing with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's right. I mean, there are kind of two worries that I get about the book, sometimes depending on whether I'm talking within the U.S. or talking abroad. And the one within the U.S. is the worry that it's too robust a response and that we should just protect the speech and the state should have no opinion about what is true and what is false. The other worry, though, which you raise, is that this is just too weak a response. I mean, the thing about criminalization is that it doesn't invite a conversation, it just ends it. And it also arguably is more effective, some people think, than the persuasive capacity. I think it's not enough for the state to do what I'm suggesting in order to ensure a culture of liberal democratic values flourishing. I think you also need a robust civil society. And so the vision that I have is one in which the state has an official position, an official response, but it's also supporting, I think, importantly, a part of the argument within civil society. I don't think, and this is something that I think a lot of people who are for banning hate speech, for instance, or banning some of the forms of inegalitarian speech that I'm talking about, a lot of them think that by protecting it, we risk sanctifying it or condoning it, or even, and this is how I began, suggesting that the state is neutral about it. And they suggest that the only way to really show the force of what's wrong with these views is to ban it. And that's not just true of Europeans, it's true of some philosophers. Jeremy Waldron has a recent book arguing for banning certain forms of hate speech. But on my view, I think that is a risk, and that is a real concern about the current state of affairs in which we just protect the speech, and which there isn't as robust as I would like to see a culture of protecting it and criticizing it. I think that with conversation and with argument, and especially with the state using its various capacities that I've suggested are open to it, there's a way of sending that more nuanced message that the speech should be protected, but not because it's worth engaging or considering, but just because of the idea that in a liberal democracy we let everybody express their own view, and we think that in responding there might be a truth of the matter that comes out, and there might be a clarification. So I think that what the view tries to do is to show that protecting something is not the same as giving it any status at all. We protect, for instance, just to move away from more heated examples, the Flat Earth Club is a club in the United States. I think they must have some web presence that people can look up, that defends the idea that the Earth is flat. That's worth protecting, I think, because it's a viewpoint, it's a false one, but it's one that people exercising their autonomy as citizens, I think, should be free to both make the arguments and, importantly, and this is just as fundamental for me, to consider whether they want to reject them. And as a matter of free choice, reject the notion that there is a flat Earth and that there is a conspiracy about the idea that the Earth is round. That doesn't mean that there's any value to the idea of the Flat Earth Club, or that the idea that there's a conspiracy about the round Earth. Instead, I think it just speaks to the robustness and the strength with which we're willing to defend all views. Well, similarly, in more moral issues, I think, and issues of political morality, I think it's important to protect all of these views, even those that are way off. But we have to get away from the idea that protection is some sort of sanctification or a respect for it as a view worth considering. So Holocaust denial is not a view worth considering. Neither are the views of the Ku Klux Klan about the inequality fundamentally of African Americans under law. But they're views that I think are worth protecting in order to criticize, and in some cases to condemn them, I guess, is the theme. Not just protect, but also condemn.
Now, what are you going to do in a situation where, I don't know what the proportion of Muslims in the United States population is, but I'm going to be guessing that it's well under 10%.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to be guessing that, theologically speaking, that relatively small Muslim population in the United States is not as, I don't know what the right word is here, fundamentalist, or, sort of conservative, radically conservative in their theology, as some of the madrasas that one might find in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or some such place.
Mm-hmm.
But let's just suppose hypothetically that it was 25% Muslim, and let's just suppose hypothetically that within that 25% there was a substantial, number of, very sort of theologically conservative and strict believers. And someone has the view that, I don't know, something that's very disparaging of the Prophet Muhammad. They think he was a drunkard. They think he was a womanizer.
Right.
That he was a fraud. That I'm not expressing these views myself. I want the listening audience to understand.
Right.
I'm imagining someone who might express it.
Hypothetical. Right.
But if it were the predictable consequence of such an expression, that the probability of violent reactions to that speech would be noticeably high, and pose a threat to civil order and to the person and property of innocence, notwithstanding the quote, irrationality, close quote, of a violent reaction to someone's disparaging of the Prophet Muhammad. Some of us might think it irrational. Might it not be not only the most pragmatic course, but somehow the most sort of ethically defensible course to preclude that kind of expression, to outlaw it, to ban it, to use the state's coercive capacities to limit it, rather than to argue with it.
Right. And I've seen, I think I should look at it more closely, but there's a piece by Eric Posner suggesting in Slate that this is something that we might consider, given the reactions around the world to the protection of this video, that maybe the United States just values free speech too much, especially when the reactions out there might, on balance, be so bad that we have to reconsider. I should start off by saying, I think, again, that there is this third alternative, right, that the reason why those arguments are getting traction, I think, for banning free speech or considering some amended version of blasphemy laws, for instance, is precisely, I think, because we're searching for the language of criticizing those like the makers of this video that really are seeking, I think their intent seems to be to provoke a reaction and to offend and to disparage. I think the State Department in this case involving the video was on to something with the idea that, look, just because the view is protected doesn't mean that it has a status in the United States or in liberal democracies on par with other views. It's possible, I think, for the state officially to condemn the message of that video and at the same time to protect it. It's a complicated way of getting, but that might be, I mean, one thing that we don't know, because we've only had these two alternatives of ban and not ban, is whether there is an effective culture of free speech that can protect but also give rise to the kind of criticism that would implicitly and explicitly show respect to those who are disparaged by free speech. But the idea that it's not the government's speech in that instance, it's private speech that's at odds with the views of the government, and that the state, in that instance, through the State Department and now through commercials that the Obama administration is running abroad, can effectively, and I think rightly, it's not only is that not a free speech violation, but it's required, I think, for a robust defense of free speech to criticize some of these views. Not because they're at odds with religion, but in these cases because I think they really intend to degrade an entire religion, to degrade Islam in this case.
Yeah. What I was trying to interject there.
Sorry.
See if I can get my, no, that's okay. Get my thinking clear. Was when the Obama administration did use its expressive capacity as a state agent to argue with the video rather than to prohibit it, it was criticized precisely because the act of expressing distaste for the video gave indication of a concern about the sensibilities of the people who were offended by the video. And certain observers thought that it was more important for the administration to affirm this constitutional value of free speech than it was to show a empathetic, awareness of and concern about the sensibilities of a bunch of Muslims.
That's right.
A bunch of irrational Muslims around the world who were offended by this.
That's right. Yeah, and I think that's right. And I've seen several reactions to that effect that say the State Department was risking not defending free speech, or in the most crude way, some versions say they were violating free speech by taking a position on the video. And I think that just gets it all wrong. It misunderstands the free speech tradition, which is about protection from criminal sanction. But it doesn't go with the free speech protection that there are no false ideas, or that there's not a such thing as speech which degrades an entire religion and that's at odds with the values of tolerance and religious freedom and liberal democracy itself. I mean, we have a protection of religious freedom in this country for a reason, and what I think the Obama administration is doing when it criticizes the content of the video is explaining why we have that tradition, and it's contrasting protection with approval.
I want to interrupt for a minute. Excuse me. I mean, because there's something about that's going on here that I'm not persuaded is valid. Your book is about, as I understand it, how a society ought to order itself.
Right.
Okay? But this discourse that we're discussing right now, with the video and the reaction and the American government statements, is a discourse across cultural, nation state, and, if you will, civilizational lines.
Right.
And it's not at all clear to me that the logic of a sort of intra-state debate about the limitations on speech and the responsibilities of government's expressive action carries over to a, if you will, clash of civilizations universe, to a global universe where you've got these large and disparate, world systems in tension with one another. And it may be that in that context, at least certainly this is some conservatives' view, the role of the American government is to affirm the kind of defining tenets of the American cultural, political, philosophic posture in this world of, if not clash of civilizations, then tensions between them.
Right.
Rather than to pretend that this was something that happened in New York City or in Skokie, Illinois, and then follow Brettschneider's formula.
Right. I mean, I'll say two things. One is that even if we just take your stopping point, which is the domestic realm, I think even issues of international affairs are going to raise issues of free speech and state speech. So there are people within the borders of the United States, I think, that were offended by the video. A lot of the news has been about the reaction abroad. But in part, I think the State Department isn't just speaking to other nations. It's also speaking to our own citizens, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, when it says, look, we protect this thing, but we certainly don't approve of it. And in fact, we want to criticize it and condemn it. That's a way of clarifying to ourselves, even when we're speaking to people abroad, about what our own values are. And I think that there's a way of just analyzing what happened on those grounds, that it's a kind of a process of self-definition. We have an extremely pluralistic country of over 150 million people with views, I think as many views represented likely here as there are around the world. And so when we engage on the world stage, we're also, I think, talking to ourselves. But I will take the more controversial question that you raised. I mean, I think what's at stake in the book and in this example and in talking about free speech isn't just a question of how the free speech tradition should be understood within the United States. I mean, I think our conversation to some extent, and all conversations about free speech, have a comparative politics dimension to them, in that we're comparing different ways of understanding free speech in a democracy and different models. And a lot of the countries that were offended by the video themselves, I mean, because of their Arab Spring, are now asking themselves what kind of democracy they want to live in. And I think this third model offers a way forward, not just for the United States, although I think it's essential that the U.S., if it's going to have this robust free speech protection, also embrace the idea of state speech and state criticism. But I also think it serves as a possible model to those abroad of how it's possible to have a free speech tradition and also to respect the human dignity of various religions, including Islam. It's I think I do want to say it's a global argument, not just one that's local. I think it offers the best alternative to the militant democracy tradition of banning hate speech and blasphemy or variety of different in the American model.
Let me ask something that's in the same general area, religion and free speech. Okay, so we have free exercise and non-establishment clauses of the First Amendment with respect to religion. And people's sort of freedom of conscience with respect to religion. And then we also have issues about free expression, and you have arguments about, okay, maybe free, but not completely free. I mean, that is maybe not prohibited, but not gone unanswered.
Right.
Now, I was having a conversation with my son, Glenn II, not long ago, in which, and he's a gay man, and he and I have different views about how negatively we should feel when religious people express antipathy to homosexuality.
Right.
Okay? So let's just stipulate here for the sake of argument that liberal democratic values require equality of status for people independently of their sexual orientation.
And I say that in the book, as you know. That's a big theme.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And I'm not disputing it, although I suppose there could be an argument about that, but I don't want to carry that argument forward. I just want to say, let's suppose that that's the case, so that people who are anti-gay marriage or who feel that homosexuality is an abomination, is condemned by God or whatever, would be speaking in a way that's contrary to that value.
Right.
On the other hand, they may be speaking that for reasons of their own religious conviction.
Absolutely, right.
And indeed, my son asked me whether or not I thought these, in the particular case at hand, it was a congregation that I attend that is cool toward marriage equality, that are not endorsers of equal status for homosexual marriage.
Right.
And my son asked me whether or not I was more and those are views that I personally disagreed with, but I was not as condemnatory of as my son.
Right.
And he asked if I was cutting them slack in part because the view was religiously motivated, and I hadn't thought the thing through theoretically. I just answered honestly, and the honest answer was yes.
Right.
I thought that the religious motivation for those views made them less offensive to me somehow. I was willing to cut people more slack on that for some reason. And I'm wondering, and I'm not sure that I could defend that. I'm wondering whether or not you would agree or how you would react to this question that I'm trying to ask you, which is, should the state be less aggressively countering of anti-liberal speech when that speech is rooted in a genuine religious conviction than otherwise?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I left it to the end of the book. That's the last chapter, is just ask exactly that question. Is there an exemption when it comes to religious views which might have this anti-liberal quality? So I'll give you an actual case that really sums it up, because as we've said, the theme of the book is that religious expression, like all expression, religious practice, gets robust protection when it comes to issues of punishment, for instance. So the idea of punishing any religious speech, I am adamantly opposed to any punishment for religious speech, and defend the idea in the tradition of the free exercise and free speech clauses that all religious expression gets protection and should not be subject to punishment. But now, what about this question of whether the state in its expressive capacity should criticize some religious speech or defund it? I'll give you an example that I think is the most salient, in a way, in the recent Supreme Court jurisprudence, and I'm going to be talking about this actually with one of the people who litigated the case at the Federalist Society National Convention in Washington, D.C., former Judge Michael McConnell, now professor at Stanford Law School, which I attended. So the case is about the following question. Hastings Law School has a club that's part of the school, the Christian Legal Society. It's a national organization with a branch at Hastings Law School. And the club admits gay members, but it won't allow gays into leadership positions. They can't run or hold any leadership positions.
This is at a law school?
This is at Hastings Law School, which is a public law school in California and San Francisco. And the question that leads to this Supreme Court case, the Christian Legal Society versus Martinez, is whether Hastings has the entitlement to withdraw recognition of the club as an official student organization, and the fundamental point is whether it can withdraw funding to the club because of this policy. Hastings Law School has a tolerance policy that it calls its all-comers policy, which requires that regardless of race, gender, or sexual orientation, that all students at the law school have to be admitted into all clubs. Now, because of this position about leadership positions within the Christian Legal Society is at odds with it, so Hastings withdraws its funding. Now you can see where this leads. It raises a whole host of issues, and what Christian Legal Society argued throughout the litigation, including at the Supreme Court, is that its free speech rights, its freedom of association, and its free exercise rights were violated by the withdrawal of these funds, because after all, the Christian Legal Society said, look, this is a fundamental part of our belief, is that the practice of homosexuality, that's how they put it, violates basically the central tenets of what it means to be a good Christian and to be a good Christian lawyer more generally. So that's got exactly the dynamic. Hastings is not saying, importantly, that they don't have the right to be on campus or the right to say what they want. They're just denying the funding and the official recognition. Now, I defend Hastings' position in the book. I think the Supreme Court had a convoluted way. They came out on the side of Hastings Law School and defended their right to withdraw the entitlement to withdraw the funding. They said that the rule was neutral and the all-comers policy was neutral. I think there's a real question about that. I think there's a cleaner way of explaining what's happening in that case. On my view, Hastings is saying, look, you have an entitlement to these beliefs, to say them, to practice them, even to have an organization around them. But when it comes to the kind of viewpoint that this is my way of doing it, not the courts, that the state is going to fund, we're going to promote this ideal of all people, regardless of sexual orientation, being part of organizations, and the idea that gays, like straights, have equal status at the law school and in society at large, and as lawyers in the service of the public good or the private good. That's, I think, how they should have done the case. So to me, the court had an opportunity to just say this is an instance of the state promoting its own values, which it should be free to do. It did come out on my side the way I think it should have, but it used a very different kind of analysis, arguing that this was a limited public forum and that the law school's rule was viewpoint neutral. I think that confuses what's going on here and what neutrality is. To say that you're going to defend tolerance and that you're going to defend the idea of gays having equal status under law, as you began by saying, it's a viewpoint that's at odds with not only some viewpoints, but some fundamental religious viewpoints. And I think that it's important in these cases to recognize that there is a clash of ideas going on here, and that all of these ideas deserve protection, but they all don't have to be endorsed by the state, and they all don't have to be funded. And so the cleaner way to do this, I think, is to acknowledge that there is a debate going on here between different viewpoints, but in my view, the doctrine should be developed and policies at law schools or public schools in general should be developed to emphasize that the state has an entitlement to promote its own liberal democratic values, which includes the idea that gays and straights have equal status.
Let me just ask you, Corey, hold on, about your audio. I don't know if there's something going on your side. Are you too close to the microphone or something like that?
I didn't.
Okay,
How's that? Is that better?
Not really, but let's go on. I can hear you and understand you. I just thought there might be something you could do quickly.
Okay.
Let's talk about political correctness for a minute. We talked about your book. Can we talk about my article?
Yes, that'd be great. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for sending it.
Not at all. Okay,
you want to say the
title? I'm sorry. Say it again, please.
Did you want to give the title for everyone?
Yeah. Self-censorship and public discourse: a theory of political correctness and related phenomena, published 18 years ago in Rationality and Society. Mm-hmm. James S. Coleman, the great sociologist, was editing he's now dead. He was mm-hmm. editing the journal at that time. And, he heard me give a presentation. He said, we really have to have this piece. I worked for 2 years trying to write something that didn't have equations in it.
It has light game theory, I saw, but not a lot of equations.
It's got some game theory ideas in it, but I don't write down the equations. It's mainly, I don't know what it is. I don't know if
it's a nice piece of political philosophy, I thought. It should be in our department.
Well, tell your colleagues. But I'm curious how you, I was an untutored, sort of trespasser over there in your field,
Right.
Reacted to the argument of that essay, and maybe I can let you, in your response, also explain a little bit about how you understood that argument. I'm happy to do that if you prefer.
Yeah. Well, let me try to start building it, and then maybe you could add, but I'll begin the process. One thing I think that's important to note, too, is that you're writing in the midst of the culture war debate about political correctness, which in part was about speech codes, but was also, I think, about a certain kind of culture on campus. And if you talk to academics who were writing and around at that time, I think the worry was that there really was just a culture of not of sanctioning, and we could talk about what that means, but of really strongly disapproving of conservative views to the extent that it was hard to feel a kind of freedom to get them out. And so the way I understand your piece is it's not about the question of government bans or not bans, but it's a question of how do we understand this phenomenon in the culture where conservatives feel like they aren't able to fully articulate their considered viewpoints because of a worry about not government sanction, but a kind of cultural sanction.
There you go. That's exactly it.
And you're weighing,
and not only conservatives,
threat, as you put it, in the conversation, and you're worried that it's imposing on views that are, well considered, maybe wrong on balance, but certainly in that realm of reasonable disagreement, like sanctions and South Africa, the question of whether the U.S. government should constructively engage South African apartheid government, or whether sanctions were the right course. That's one of the examples, right? That you're
right. It is.
Right. Does that get to it, or is there more that you want to say?
No. Well, the distinction between the iron fist of repression, where the state uses its monopoly on the legitimate use of force to, compel compliance with a view, and the velvet glove of seduction, where the anticipation of social punishment. I'm not going to be invited to dinner. People are going to think I'm a bad guy. I can't marry my child, daughter, or son because people will think that I'm one of those that believes this. And I was trying to sort of say that in a lot of situations, the constraint on speech is not a result of compulsion, but it's a self-imposed limitation that people adopt because they don't want to bear the social consequences of having been seen to speak in an unpopular way.
Right.
And it seemed to me that was the essence of, as you say, the very period-specific phenomenon of campus political correctness about which conservatives were complaining. But I want to stress, of course, it's not only conservatives who would be limited in this way, right? I mean, it would, if I'm an African American who thinks, I don't know what, Barack Obama is full of it, I don't have to think that being a conservative, I might just think that.
Right.
And people might be very annoyed with me being an African American, feel that I'm somehow disloyal, or if I have certain views about the Israel-Palestinian conflict and I'm prepared to voice them, I don't have to be Jewish. I could still find myself sanctioned and so on. And it seems to me that the tiptoeing around these issues of that are, as you say, open to reasonable debate. Now, the moral status of homosexuality is not one of them, as I understand you.
Right.
Open to reasonable debate, but I bet you I could muster a few score. Oh, by the way, there are 300 million Americans, Corey, not 150.
I'm sure
and I bet you I could get a few score million Americans. Exactly.
Right.
Who would differ with that. So that's kind of what it was. And I was trying to explore in there, through these examples and through some abstract sort of political theorizing, what the implications of such behavior might be. I mean, for example, denying of facts, people not being able to have factual discussions about objective matters because the very act of being willing to look for facts or question certain suppositions is taken to be an indication of a person being on the wrong side of history. Or these notions about insiders and outsiders, for some of these equality affecting discourses where it's about the status of women or racial minority or sexual preference or something like that, speech acts undertaken by people who belong to the groups that could be subject to the inequality or domination or whatever are absolutely different from speech acts undertaken by other people. Use of the N-word by an African American in a certain context is unremarkable,
right?
And in use of it by another person who doesn't belong to the group in almost any context is inexcusable.
Yeah.
This kind of thing. The fact that people will look for cover, that they'll look for kind of plausible deniability, that they'll intentionally be imprecise in what they say in order to give themselves wiggle room about what their motives for saying it might have been,
right?
And many other things beside. And also concerned about the fact that it seemed to me genuine moral argument about questions that are close and that are open to reasonable debate requires. It could get cut off unless people have the courage to just fly in the face of the likelihood that they're going to be socially sanctioned, and often they don't have it, and so a kind of superficial morality ends up reigning.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think
reality. Let me just say this:
really
the
well
reality
piece too is that there are these. I mean, it's in the tradition of Mill that there are these social sanctions at the time. You're saying anyway that are really operating in the background that aren't just cutting down on the extreme instances of racism or of the worst kind of homophobic views, but that are just cutting down on all discussion, period. So take the sanctions debate, which is one that, I'm sure you and your colleagues know well. There's an empirical question. I mean, imagine that all sides are trying to achieve transitional justice in South Africa. I happen to think sanctions worked in that case, but there's a real debate
I think that's what the record shows
about it. And if what's happening is that one side is just being shut down, then there isn't a possibility of even the most basic moral discussion. And I have heard, especially from people of the generation where they were either in graduate school or teaching young professors at the time, that there was a period, they feel like, in the late 80s, early 90s, where conservative views weren't just criticized or weren't criticized at all, but they were hissed at. So if you were in a public forum and you said something that smacked of a defense of Ronald Reagan or of supply side economics, take your pick, that actually you were just booed and that you were literally silenced in that sense. So one thing I guess that I just want to agree with is the idea that we have to be really attuned to the way that we use social coercion and social sanction in order to cut off discussion. And I think it's important in the protection of free speech that we emphasize that there are ways of undermining it at the same time that we're supposedly protecting it. I guess if it's meant to be, I don't know if it's a challenge to the view that I've laid out in the book, which is really about the state taking positions on these extreme instances. It seems to me that one real problem is that there isn't a culture of free speech in the forums that you're describing when it comes to really hard cases where there are empirical questions and reasonable disagreement. This isn't the issue of what to do with the Holocaust denier. It's the issue of what do you do when there are two sides, partisan or otherwise, a divide on some empirical or really tough.
Corey, let me get in here now.
Sure.
I first wanted to just simply observe that one part of my argument on this, the cost of these social sanctions to unpopular speech, being that some moral debate gets kind of reduced to a morality of expressive convention, not to a substantive engagement with the question at hand. So hissing somebody who says capitalism is good or Reaganomics worked is really about they farted in church. How dare you speak that way? Okay, so we just don't do it. Okay, and so that's a real
did you at the time feel that? I mean, I guess I could just ask you. Did you think that? I mean, you were taking positions at that time, I take it, that were outside the liberal mainstream. Did you feel that there really was a kind of culture of not just criticism but social coercion that was present in the different forums that you were part of?
Absolutely, there was. I don't think there's any doubt about that, though I think it's not intellectually very deep to make yourself into a victim and to dwell on the fact that, people won't let me say people. So I wasn't inclined to all the belly aching, but I do think that there was a certain amount of repression.
That was one worry sometimes, is that it sometimes gets characterized in a way that, that it was the gulag or that there was
let me get to something else.
Like that. It was more subtle, I think.
Yeah, it was more subtle. It was not the gulag, no, but it was real. Right. But let me get to something else, which is, I mean, one of the debates, race and intelligence.
Right.
Okay, the bell curve, Charles Murray, Richard Herrnstein. Richard Herrnstein. And then there were these other guys, Rushton. There's these other academics less famous than these guys who had done scientific papers investigating questions of whether or not there were, innate differences, genetically grounded and passed on across the generations between these distinct human populations that evolved in relative isolation from each other for many thousands of years in the capacity of intellectual, ability. Mm-hmm. And some people took the view, and take the view, that a scientist who's prepared to raise and explore these questions seriously has already committed a moral error. And take the view that there should be a kind of self-censorship in the interest of equality, limiting that kind of inquiry. Now, not compelled by government, although they might argue that government shouldn't fund the research for a reason similar to those I think that you are fostering in your argument about what should the state say when it speaks. It should say things that promote the values of liberal democracy. And seeing, the residents of inner city ghettos and housing projects and our prisons and jails who are disproportionately black as being there because they're stupid and there's nothing that can be done about it, is definitely inegalitarian and inconsistent with the values of liberal democracy, at least I would say so.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
On the other hand, science is science, and these are questions of fact, right? Just like the Holocaust is a question of historical fact.
Right.
Okay? You say no Holocaust denying only because somebody's investigated the fact and established what it is.
Right.
Okay? Likewise here, can you legitimately preclude, or should the government even disfavor inquiry on questions that do bear on the liberal democratic values, but that are nevertheless questions of fact, not matters of value. They're not normative questions at all.
Yeah. I mean, I think I agree with the instinct that you had and the intuition. I want to ask you something about the substance of the work, because I think you're more prepared than pretty much anyone in the population to speak to its validity. But I think that's right, that when it comes to the question of what should be funded, at least, I mean, wouldn't argue that the bell curve should have been banned or prevented from being published, but that doesn't seem like the kind of work that national funds set up for the inquiries of science and progress in society, that they should be funded, precisely because I think what you said is right, that this isn't an inquiry that's really devoted to improving social conditions or realizing an ideal of equality. But I have to say part of that, and this is what I want to ask you about, is due to my instinct that the work just isn't that good, and that the claim of being scientific and of offering real evidence in the bell curve, that upon investigation by experts, that it just turns out to not be a very serious piece of inquiry. Now, you're an economist and you know the book well, so I guess I can ask you whether that's true. And if it is, then it's a really easy case, because it's not only problematic in the question and the frame, it's just problematic on the merits. So,
well, let me discriminate between the bell curve and the field of inquiry.
I see.
The field of inquiry being racial differences in human intelligence that may have a genetic foundation. Now, the bell curve was a popular book. I mean, it was a book written for a popular audience. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and it was very widely read. It was not a work of science. It synthesized and reported on the findings across an array of fields of research that was undertaken by serious scientists. My own view, personally, from having read and studied the book, including all the appendices and all the technical aspect, and also from having paid close attention to serious reviews of that book that were written by economists and sociologists and cognitive psychologists and others, is that it wasn't a very sound piece of scientific reportage. Okay, that is simply reportage. It was not, because it wasn't science itself. It was a second-order enterprise in which they were pulling together and telling us what we know based on science, but it was flawed. It was flawed at many levels. It was flawed at many levels, and we could go into the detail, but that would be a whole other program. That's just my view, and I think it's a view that's widely shared amongst experts in the field.
Yeah.
On the other hand, my original question to you, which I used the bell curve to illustrate, wasn't just about that work. I mean, the National Science Foundation.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you just to go back to the book. I have an example that I think we'll get to it. Take just as an analogy to this question. The National Endowment for the Arts, right? There's a famous Supreme Court case about the question of whether or not denial to certain artists of funding can potentially constitute a free speech violation when it comes to the use of funds. So here's just a hypothetical example that I think it's not the actual case, but it gets to, in some ways, it's what the court said would be a harder case, but that gets to your question. So imagine that there's a extremely well done piece of filmmaking that it's like Birth of a Nation. It has a Klan or a Nazi sort of theme in its purpose, but artistically it's extremely well done. So the question isn't whether it has artistic merit. Let's just concede that it does. But the question is whether or not the state should be funding a piece of ideology that's at cross purposes with the idea. I
don't think these cases are comparable. No. I mean, I think the National Science Foundation exists,
right?
And the enterprise of science is about getting to the bottom of what's true about important questions. There's no denying that the biogenetic basis, if any, of human variability and intellectual function is an important question. So a decision not to fund a script or a piece of documentary filmmaking or whatever that, while it might be of high artistic value, was nevertheless noxious politically. It doesn't seem to me to be comparable to a decision about whether or not to fund a study that wants to inquire into the biogenetic basis of human intelligence. The latter is science. And the editing of the scientific agenda to conform with the requirements of a liberal democracy strikes me as a very, very dicey thing to be doing. I mean, let me put it the other way around. I mean, let me give it, the obvious example that comes to mind is climate science, global warming, and all of that. I mean, the bias in the funding stream for investigators who want to inquire about that question, driven by normative judgments concerning the importance of us making adaptations in our ways of living to accommodate human populations with preservation of the earth and of the environment, is a very bad thing.
There might just be a difference between art and science in that it seems like you want to concede that, look, when it comes to what the NEA should fund, it's not just artistic merit that might matter. We might have these other values that are... But when it comes to science, that's just a different thing. That's about truth. And if the government starts to pick among... I mean, I guess the one... I was not sure what I thought about the issue. I mean, I thought the art one is clearer, and I'll have to think about it. But... imagine a view that said, look, the government has to just pick which projects it's going to choose, and it could choose just on the basis of truth and potential truth finding, or it could choose on the basis of truth finding plus some kind of public concern about science that's going to further public policy and the common good. So maybe it's that certain forms, and now the pure mathematicians might be upset with this, but certain forms of pure math, it's not as clear what the impact on the public good would be, but it is pretty clear when it comes to certain forms of applied math, and even though both might be in the interest of truth, it's applied math that we're going to fund. I was wondering if, and you're pushing back against this, I think for good reasons, whether when it comes to a National Science Foundation, whether we might just, in political science we find this, there are lots and lots of inquiries and grant proposals that are all probably fine questions, and we can trust that the researchers are all sincere in their approach, trying to find the truth. But there's scarce money out there, so what are we going to fund? And it might be that there's some kinds of questions that are better than others.
I get the point, and I think we have to conclude here, Corey. But I would summarize as saying we have our priorities,
right,
and the establishment of our priorities can be influenced by normative as well as objective scientific considerations. even though these prohibition questions, we might not want to do it like
well,
that.
I'm with you too in the worry that you certainly wouldn't want to use a political agenda to cut off what's legitimate truth inquiry, even if sometimes the results are not to our liking.
Okay, we can end on that point of disagreement. Thanks so much, Corey.
Okay, thank you, Glenn, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, take care.